Okay.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to the All You Serve November webinar. Thank you for spending your time with us this afternoon to learn more. Just some housekeeping tips. My name is Marcia Diamond and I'm New Business Development with All You Serve. My email will be included in this if you have any questions, but as well as I wanted to go over some housekeeping tips. The All You Serve webinar will be recorded and will be posted at the All You Serve site, as well as by next Wednesday you will have the recording, the PowerPoint slideshow, and the certification of participation for the CEU credit will be there as well. If you have any questions, please type it in and we will get to it sometime during the presentation. As well as if you're listening to this in a group mode, please make sure you mute it so that outside noises does not be heard by others. Okay, again, welcome to the All You Serve webinar and thank you for joining us today. Once again, as you posted, the housekeeping tips, webinar recording, PowerPoint slideshow, and certification of participation will be available by next Wednesday at www.allyouserve.com. Okay, so let's get started. My name is Marcia Diamond and thank you for joining us today on this very hot topic, gluten-free lifestyle. Today we have with us three very expertise in this area and are willing to share with us. Our first speaker is Barbara Callahan. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong and I'm going to hear this from Barbara. By the way, any of the panelists, please mute when I'm not speaking so we get no background noises at all. And anyone else on the presentation, please mute it. Barbara is a graduate of the CIA in Hyde Park and holds an MS in management with a concentration in supply chain. She has over 20 years of distribution, operational, and culinary experience in the food service industry with specialization in the healthcare sector. Her expertise includes program, recipe, and menu development for clients with food allergies and dietary intolerance. Barbara, with her sister Joan, own and operate JCB Consulting Services, a company that offers gluten-free and allergy consulting services to food service venues, as well as individual client care. Barbara teaches, and where she teaches healthy gluten-free cooking, and she has been a guest chef on Cablevision's Food for Thought. Her gluten-free confections are now featured in Nordstrom's eBar, and Barbara has maintained a gluten-free lifestyle since 2004 and has become an advocate for those like herself who suffer from celiac disease. Joan is a registered nurse with an MBA in Healthcare and Hospitality Management. She is a graduate of Malloy's College School of Nursing and earned her MBA at Adelphi University, where she's a guest instructor for professional development. She has over 20 years of healthcare experience, and she too raises awareness for food allergies and celiac disease. Todd Dana is devoted to helping people incorporate healthy eating into their daily lifestyle. Todd is an executive chef who has his own company as well as the executive chef of Overlook Medical Center. Todd has won numerous chef challenges and has competed on national stage of chef challenges, including Tyson's National Chef Challenges featured on Fox Television. Most recently, Todd has accepted a chef position with the Culinary Enrichment Innovative Program sponsored by Hormel Foods and the CIA of America. Todd is one of 16 honored applicants chosen, as well as he has developed a whole line of foods for gluten-free cooking. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for sharing your knowledge. If any of you are tweeters and are going to be tweeting out, hashtag AllYouServeWebinar to tweet out for this webinar. We are very grateful that All You Serve was willing to sponsor these speakers and bring this topic to fruition. Today's objectives will be to gain a thorough understanding of the gluten-free lifestyle, Understand what the gluten offenders are and our interventions for avoiding them. Becoming familiar with the FDA gluten-free labeling rules and strategy for offering choices and options in today's food service venues. So you will walk away with an understanding, know what the offenders are, know the labeling rules, and also some strategies for implementing in your operation.
Okay. Thank you, Marcia, for having us today to present such an important and pertinent topic. To begin, we would like to distinguish between celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Celiac disease is an autoimmune disorder where the body attacks the villi in the small intestines when gluten, a protein found in wheat, barley, and rye, is eaten. A person with undiagnosed celiac disease is often malnourished because the villi in the small intestines are critical to absorbing valuable nutrients from digested food in order to live. The villi in a person with celiac disease becomes damaged. They are finger-like projections that stick out of the wall of the small intestines and absorb nutrients. When a person has celiac disease, the villi becomes shorter and stubby and cannot grab the nutrients. The body identifies gluten as the invader and damages the villi, an autoimmune response. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity, formerly known as gluten intolerance, is when a person is unable to tolerate gluten and develops an adverse reaction when it is consumed. This is not an autoimmune disorder, and there is no damage to the villi of the small intestines. But people with this sensitivity do have symptoms that are only resolved when gluten is eliminated. It is very difficult to diagnose, and it is really only diagnosed through trial and error and ruling out other disorders. It is neither autoimmune nor allergenic. Researchers think it is an innate immunity. Therefore, going back to celiac disease, if it goes undiagnosed, since it is an autoimmune disorder, the development of other autoimmune diseases could develop, such as insulin diabetes type 1, liver diseases, thyroid diseases, lupus, chronic active hepatitis, rheumatoid arthritis, Raynaud syndrome, alopecia, and scleroderma, are just to name a few. What is gluten? First and foremost, gluten is a protein. The building blocks of proteins are amino acids, and gluten is made up of 2 amino acids, which are gliadin and glutenin, which combine to form gluten. Gluten is found in wheat, rye, and barley, and any derivatives of these grains. The property of gluten is that it gives elasticity to dough for ease of use. It undergoes a chemical reaction, trapping carbon dioxide in its chain and expanding the gas so the dough is elastic. Actually, the word gluten comes from the Latin for glue, thus accurately describing its properties. I'm going to review some facts regarding being gluten-free and celiac disease. There are 1 in 20 Americans who are gluten-free as a medical necessity. 1 in 133 have celiac disease. And out of these 2.4 million Americans, about 2 million have yet to be diagnosed. The average time for diagnosis from the onset of symptoms, which number over 300 and can include gastric problems, joint pain, and fatigue, is about 10 years. And celiac disease is actually more common than many diseases, including lupus, Crohn's disease, and MS. Sales of gluten-free products are estimated to hit $2.34 billion by 2019. And the majority of the consumers that are purchasing these products are not gluten-free due to a medical necessity. Gluten-free cuisine remains on the National Restaurant Association's What's Hot survey for 2016. And a particle of gluten the size of a grain of wheat can make a person with celiac disease sick, raising the risk for many cancers, including lymphoma. There are two terms that need to be clarified, and they're frequently used and interchangeable, but they really should not be. One is gluten-free friendly, and the other is gluten-free. A person who follows a gluten-free friendly is following a diet that is a lifestyle choice. They are following a gluten-free diet as their choice because they want to, and it makes them feel better. A person following a gluten-free diet is doing so out of a medical necessity. The term free also relates to allergen-free for someone who has a food allergy, and a person with a dietary intolerance would also follow a free diet as a medical necessity. There are many celebrities these days that are following a gluten-free diet as a lifestyle choice particularly, and they do not have a medical necessity. But the people who have celiac disease must do it in order to be healthy. And how to maintain a gluten-free lifestyle? There is no cure or medication to take to eliminate celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. The person must maintain a completely gluten-free lifestyle in order to be healthy. Once a person is diagnosed with celiac disease, it takes 6 months to a year for the body to heal itself and the villi to regenerate. That is the good news. The body does heal. To understand the implications of being contaminated with gluten for a person with celiac disease while on a gluten-free diet, a particle of gluten the size of a grain of wheat, as Barbara said, is minuscule and can make a person sick and have symptoms. Therefore, the importance of proper training and education is essential in order to provide safe food alternatives for this population. The safe foods that a person on a gluten-free diet should eat are any meats, poultry, fish, dairy items, fruits, vegetables, and beans that are in their unaltered and natural states. These are acceptable for that person following a gluten-free diet. Other gluten-free grains include yucca, buckwheat, quinoa, sorghum, millet, amaranth, mesquite, and teff. In addition to wheat, rye, and barley, there are other unsafe grains that a person on a gluten-free diet must avoid, and those include spelt, farro, and contaminated oats. Oats are a controversial topic for a person following a gluten-free diet because they can be contaminated in growing or processing. With that being said, all grains run the risk of contamination and should be used only from a trusted manufacturer and for the supply chain to be verified. Cross-contact. Gluten is sticky and lurks everywhere. And this is the utmost importance of a person, whether you're following a gluten-free diet or you're following a diet to avoid a particular allergen. Cross-contact is so important to avoid when you have some type of food that you have to avoid. Cross-contact is when a safe food comes in contact with an unsafe food. The avoidance of cross-contact is the key to providing a safe gluten-free and allergen-friendly food service program. And this is the term that should be used consistently when speaking about gluten-free and allergen-free safety. Cooking does not reduce or eliminate the chances of a person with a food allergy having a reaction to the food eaten. To effectively remove food protein from surfaces, the surface should be washed with soap and hot water. Area needs to be segregated as well as supplies and ingredients. Signage needs to be posted in the areas designated as the gluten-free and allergen-free zone, including prep areas, pantries, refrigerators, and freezers. Always use the highest shelf and cover items to avoid spillage and droppage of safe items into the gluten-free or allergen-friendly items. So it is important to remember that you should designate the cutting boards, colanders, and toasters for gluten-free use. You should always try and verify your supply chain. Use top shelves to store gluten-free foods, and all grains and flours do run the risk of cross-contamination and should always come from a trusted source. That's what I stated before. Cross-contact
can occur by human contact or human error, by using equipment that unsafe food was used on and then the safe food is placed on, or by a crumb dropping in a meal. Specific examples are using the grill to cook a hamburger when a whole wheat roll was toasted on that same grill, not washing hands and changing gloves, stirring gluten-free pasta with the same spoon that was used to stir regular pasta. It is important to note that if you use flour that contains gluten in your operation, it can stay airborne 24 to 48 hours. Gluten molecules are very heavy and can land on equipment and work surfaces that have already been cleaned and sanitized. Thus, cross-contact has occurred. Pizzerias are a big offender for airborne flour. And many of pizzerias today are saying that they offer gluten-free pizza. But a person on a gluten-free diet for a medical necessity should really be very careful when eating at a pizzeria because of the flour that is airborne for 24 to 48 hours. Even though the pizzeria may prepare the gluten-free meals in the back or the gluten-free pizza in the back, boxes and containers are usually stored up front, and the flour can land on that, thus contaminating those boxes where you're putting your gluten-free food in, and thus cross-contact has occurred, and the person who ingests that could get sick. So we recommend to try and avoid pizzerias at all costs if you can. There are different products where you would never expect gluten to be found, and they are medications for one. Some additives in medications have gluten in them. Therefore, it is very important to consult a pharmacist so they can verify your medications for you. And if necessary, a new medication may need to be prescribed by your doctor. Processed foods. The processing and ingredients may contain gluten in processed food, so it's very important that you read the label. Malt vinegar. Malt vinegar, that's very obvious. Malt contains gluten, so you would want to avoid that. Natural and artificial flavorings. That's a very vague term that you see on many labels, but unless it can be verified through the manufacturer, you want to avoid that because you really are not sure what is going in the term natural and artificial flavorings. French fries can be another offender because they can be dusted with flour, and so you would need to check the ingredient label as well for those. And herbal teas can be another offender because with the processing of herbal teas, there can be contamination with gluten. And again, check the label. We had one client who kept saying she was following her gluten-free diet. She was very careful following her gluten-free diet. We questioned her as to what she was eating, and it came up that she was having green tea practically every day. And when we researched further, the brand that she was using, in fact, did have gluten in it because of the processing that the herbal tea went through. I believe Celestial Seasonings is one of the manufacturers that's gluten-free and safe to ingest if you're on a gluten-free diet.
I have a question for you at this point. You mentioned about supply chain. So do they have a tracking device, the supply chain manufacturers, whether it's a distributor? How would somebody go about in food service to make sure or to ensure? Who should they reach out to within those supply chain to make sure that?
Sure, that's a great question. And if you have a distributor that you're using, I know that they have information where they've verified with the manufacturers that their products are in fact gluten-free if they say so. And we're going to go into the labeling information in a couple of minutes as well. And you can also go on a lot of the websites, manufacturer websites also have that information listed now, and as well as if you contact the manufacturer's customer service directly and verify with them what in fact their ingredients are in the supply chain. And it's always good to circle back with them every couple of months because a lot of times they switch suppliers, so a supplier that they could be using at this point, maybe 2 months down the road, is not the same supplier that's supplying certain ingredients that may come in contact with gluten or may contain it as well.
And another question, excellent. Another question is, you mentioned about medications. Well, a lot of people who are on the line are working within resident long-term care, hospitals, and should there be a collaboration between pharmacy, besides having an indicator and software, should there be a collaboration going over the medications to make sure there's no gluten? Because a lot of times there may be an allergy, but they're not aware that there may be a friendly versus a true friendly versus free gluten intolerance versus a gluten allergy. How would you approach that? What kind of strategy would you recommend for a medication?
Well, in particularly in long-term care, they're required to have a pharmacy review every 3 months. So I believe it's every 3 months to go and so a pharmacist has to come in and review the medications. And if they see a diagnosis of celiac disease, that pharmacist really should have the wherewithal to look into whether any of those medications that the person has might have gluten as an additive in them. And in long-term care in particular, there's a whole team approach where they do meet, so that should definitely be brought up if a person comes in with celiac disease. Again, it's required so much training and education and reinforcement for staff and everyone to realize that this could be a red flag for somebody who has a diagnosis of celiac disease and continues to have symptoms and not getting any better. And so what's the next step that you would look for? Well, I would look for then at their medications. After you've gone through and know that they're eating a gluten-free diet, well, what's the next step? Then look at something else, and it could be the medications. And definitely collaborate with the pharmacist.
And the other
collaboration. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, very important. And the other thing is, too, is that if you have a medication that's over the counter and it's also in prescription form, you need to verify, because we have had instances where a medication that was a prescription was gluten-free, but it was the over-the-counter, which had the same brand name, made by a different manufacturer, was not gluten-free.
So important, the collaboration, communication, and transparency. Thank you.
Right.
If it contains gluten, it's unsafe. And remember, just a small amount of crumbs can make someone with celiac disease sick. And wheat-free is not gluten-free. For a person with celiac disease, consuming small amounts of gluten on a daily basis really adds up and can be very detrimental. How much gluten a person with celiac disease can tolerate depends on their sensitivity to gluten cross-contact. Some small intestines never heal under 100%, even after years of maintaining a strict gluten-free diet. And it's been found that consuming more than 50 milligrams of gluten daily can cause intestinal damage. And 50 milligrams of gluten is a very, very small amount. It would be equal to 1/70th a slice of bread.
FDA and food labeling. There is one law and one rule on the books that affects ingredient labeling. The law that is on the books is the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004, also known as FLCPA. This went into effect January 2006. This involves labeling for any products that have any of the top 8 allergens in them. And the top 8 allergens account for 90% of all food allergies. They are peanuts, tree nuts, wheat, soy, dairy, eggs, fish, and shellfish. This law requires manufacturers to clearly identify on their food labels if a food product has any ingredient that contains protein derived from any of the 8 major allergenic foods and food groups. For tree nuts, fish, and crustacean shellfish, the specific type of nut or fish must be listed. This law does not include if the food was prepared in a facility that also uses one of the top 8 food allergens. But manufacturers do use that disclaimer on their labels as a courtesy to the consumer, but they are not required by law. We live in a litigious society, so manufacturers are wise to that. 2 acceptable ways that manufacturers can comply with the FLCPA are to list the allergen in the ingredient list, and they can do it in several ways. They can bold it, or they don't have to, but it's much easier if a manufacturer does that, because it certainly would stand out to a person reading the label to make sure that it's safe for them to consume. Or they can write a separate statement which says contains whatever, wheat, milk, eggs, tree nut, whatever, peanuts, whatever it is. The other rule that is on the book is the gluten-free labeling rule, which went into effect in August 2014.
The gluten-free labeling laws, as Joan said, went into effect in August of 2014, and they are not laws, they are rules. And they were established so that consumers with celiac disease would be able to choose food with greater confidence. The U.S. standards mirror the European requirement, which states that gluten-free products have to contain less than 20 parts per million of gluten from all sources. And the FDA states gluten-free food as, number one, being inherently gluten-free, number two, derived from a gluten-containing grain that has been processed to remove the gluten to less than 20 parts per million. And an example of this would be wheat starch. The FDA gluten-free labeling rules apply to all packaged foods regulated by the FDA, both imported and domestic. And medications are not included or covered with this rule. The use of the label is voluntary, as is a certification from an outside organization such as GIG or CSA. Foods that contain gluten do not have to say so. And a food labeled gluten-free cannot contain wheat, rye, or barley. Manufacturers do not have to test their product if their supply chain is verified. And ingredients made from wheat that have been processed to remove gluten are permitted. It is not required to say if products made on equipment shared with wheat have been used. And as you can see, gluten-free products still are going to contain gluten. So the downside of this law is that the FDA is only doing spot checks on manufacturers if, for example, there is a complaint that someone got sick. So it's definitely an improvement for people who have to maintain a gluten-free diet, but tighter regulations are still needed. And those are just a list of the rules that we just went over.
And just because something says wheat-free does not mean that it's gluten-free.
Right.
Okay, we have outlined some strategies and key factors of why your facility should be gluten-free and allergen-free. We know there's a lot to consider, but the outcome is well worth it for your clientele and staff. As David Letterman would say, the top 10 reasons why your facility should be gluten-free and allergen-free are: number 10, raise awareness. Heightened awareness is critical to the welfare of this population so that they can be served safely by knowledgeable staff and facilities. We are very passionate about this cause and try to spread the word as much as possible. Number 9, fulfill the need. As demonstrated by the trends and facts, this topic requires greater awareness to meet the needs of the patients, residents, and patrons. Number 8, ease your worries. Putting a formal program into your facility will ease your worries so that people can dine safely and have their needs met. No one wants to see people get sick. You should implement a program such as the one that we have, which is the Gluten-Free, Worry-Free Training Program. Number 7, take pride. This is a wonderful opportunity to provide a work environment that is top-notch and demonstrates caring and that you have taken the extra step to do the right thing. Number 6, instill confidence. The most important aspect of providing a formal program is that you will instill confidence with the patients, residents, and patrons, that you know what you are doing and that they should not fear that they will get sick. In addition, the staff will have a renewed sense of confidence as they have been given the knowledge to do the right thing. Number 5, be proactive. Be the first and become a role model. Number 4, regulatory compliance. From the start, develop a program so that it will be compliant with the FDA labeling laws and other regulatory body standards such as federal, state, local, joint commission. Number 3, well-educated staff. Knowledge is power, which will increase confidence in the patients, residents, and patrons, and your staff. This new program needs to be comprehensive so that it covers all facets, including clinical and practical aspects. Number 2, change agent. Start a movement and be a best practice facility for your peers to look up to. It will be great publicity for your institution. And number 1, patron safety and satisfaction. This is your ultimate goal, which can be accomplished with the implementation of a formal gluten-free, allergen-free food service program following the guidelines presented today.
Thank you. Todd. Todd? Oh, do we
hear
lose
me?
Todd? Yep, we hear you
Hello. All right. So, seventh inning stretch. I hope everybody is getting ready to have some ideas about cooking gluten-free and some techniques. And so our next slide, we're talking about the gluten-free, and I don't want to go back into what Barbara and Joan said about, the gluten and how it reacts with your, intestines. But what we do want to know is we want to take this to another level, right? So you want to make it friendly. You want to try to have people cook, your staff, so that they're interested in cooking gluten-free, and that way all that patient satisfaction goes to all our customers. So with this gluten-free term and the flour, what's flour used for? So we've got to look at that, right? So the molecular properties of flour, there's many reasons. Most people think of it as thickening and roux, dredging product. The reason you dredge product, because it's the Maillard effect. So what happens is we take a protein, we dredge it in flour, then we brown it off. Well, that flour acts as a conductor between the moisture from the heat that's searing the product and protects the protein. So that's an actual cooking technique that chefs have been using for years. And most people in all our industries, we all do the technique, but we don't understand why flour is in the recipe. So that's one of the main reasons. So now if we know that, and we know the molecular properties, and we could take a look at that, the Maillard reaction and the chemical reaction, well, what can we substitute? So we could take a look at things and substitute cornstarch. We could substitute every type of maybe Bison flour, which is a chickpea flour. There's many substitutions, but we need to know how the substitutions work with the actual process and technique of the product we're making. So the next slide, we have ingredient substitution list. And here's some pictures of gluten-free. The chicken franchise on the side is our gluten-free chicken franchise. So we use our own cornstarch blend. We make a mushroom flour. So we think outside the box. So we take dried porcini mushrooms, we put them in a large coffee grinder, and we grind them. And because mushroom flour could be very earthy and kind of heavy, we mix it with a tapioca starch, so it lightens it up. And we actually use that in our chicken marsala. And the reason we use that, it even enhances the chicken, the marsala flavor. So traditionally marsala is just chicken cutlets that maybe have been marinated, seasoned, dredged in flour, sauteed, where you have that Maillard reaction effect, and then you add your wine and your broth and you create your marsala with your mushrooms. Well, for us, we take the mushroom flour that we created, and it's a proprietary item for us, and we dredge it in that, and it adds that much flavor. So we're actually taking our product to another level by being gluten-free, safe cooking, allergenic-free, and adding flavor to the dish. So some of the things, the ingredients and the substitutions, Bison flour, which is traditionally used for baking. Rice flours are used for baking, and quinoa flours. Then a lot of your gluten-free starches like tapioca, potato, mushroom flour, them can be used for thickening. Cassava starch. Cassava is a real neat product because cassava is yucca and tapioca. Matter of fact, the same root, cassava root, they call it the yucca root, they call it cassava in the Caribbean. Latin America calls it yucca, and in Asia Minor, it's tapioca. And traditionally, tapioca, a lot of baking is used with tapioca flour. You could also use almond flour. We also use arrowroot for thickening. We make our own pasta, and we take cornmeal, and once again, we put it in a almost like a espresso machine or a grinder. We take the cornmeal, turn it into our own corn powder, and make our own pasta. So these are some of the ingredients and substitutions you could use. Once again, if
So I have
you
a
know
question,
exactly, sure.
Todd, I have a question as you're speaking, because I saw a picture with a hamburger without a roll, with like a rice noodles, which, so how does it affect taste, changing these things? How does it affect the taste? That was a question that came up. Does it, I saw all these wonderful substitutions, but how does that affect the taste and the profile or production of it?
Well, honestly, me as a chef, so if anybody out there was to take their finger, wet it, put it in flour, and then taste it, flour is very neutral. Flour doesn't have much taste. As a matter of fact, if you want to add flavor to a soup or a stock or a sauce, and you were going to thicken it with a traditional roux, traditionally what you do is you melt your butter, you put your roux in, and you have to let that roux cook out. You have to bring in the flavor, and while that roux is cooking out and getting nutty, that's bringing in flavor. So wheat has no flavor, right? Flour has no flavor. Now, if you were to use a Bison flour, which is a chickpea has flavor, mushroom flour. For me, as a chef, want to bring my food to the next level, I think these substitutions have better flavor than using flour. I really do. And I challenge anybody out there that's listening to do that. Go to a supermarket, try using a Bison flour and dredge your chicken in it and make a traditional saute of chicken marsala or something, or even grind your own porcini mushrooms, add it with a little cornstarch just to lighten it a little so it's not so earthy, and you can tell the difference. And for me, the flavor is huge. It brings our food to the next level.
Okay.
And it's safe.
And you would recommend using that maybe for all patients or all residents or all customers, instead of just having one that's gluten-free, you make it the normal or the product of the day versus having two different types as well. Would that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Matter of fact, when I do catering, we don't use flour. So we do a traditional chicken franchise, right? We don't dredge our chicken. The flour is just to protect the meat from the high heat, right? So the Maillard effect, we talked about that earlier, right? So you could do that with anything, so especially a starch. So what we do is, even our chicken franchise, when we make it here, we don't use flour. We dredge it in cornstarch because we have an abundance of that. So we use it in cornstarch, and it's of course economical also, but it still does the same thing. Once it's cooked, that cornstarch is a liaison for keeping the sauce, the chicken, nice and moist without drying out, and the sauce attached to the chicken. So we actually, our chicken, if you tried our chicken franchise, you wouldn't know that it wasn't used with any type of flour, and that it was used with cornstarch. As a matter of fact, a good friend of mine that I've been cooking gluten-free for in my kitchen in Clifton, Dave, he said, every time I go out in the supermarket, it seems like all the gluten-free choices are either Asian-based or Indian-based. And I tell him the reason that is, most countries, with the exception of China, doesn't use wheat and flour like we do. Matter of fact, the reason a lot of your gluten-free dinners or pre-made dinners in supermarkets and stuff are Asian-based, China doesn't have, plains like we do. They don't have the, so-called bread belt like we do. It's very mountainous. So Chinese cooking, they use mostly starches, cornstarch, rice flour, or rice starch. They call it rice flour, but rice starch. And because of their geography, they don't use a lot of wheat. So a lot of your production of gluten-free stuff is Asian-based and Indian-based because they just don't use the wheat like we do here in America. So does that make sense to everybody out there? I mean, try it. Try the potato, the tapioca. So the next slide here, we're talking about all the stuff we'd like to try, and we, molecularly, the process of molecular cooking and putting substitutions in, if we know how it all reacts and we know what gluten does in flour and why we use it, then we can use this other stuff. So this is our pasta recipe. We take regular cornmeal. We turn it into a maize flour or corn flour. We use that with a pinch of salt and water and 2 eggs, and that's how we make our, you see our pasta, how bright yellow it is. The reason that pasta is bright yellow is because of the maize, and we're using a corn base as opposed to flour base. And here's the directions for that. So
yes, and
Joan,
anyone, a couple people asked for recipes. This PowerPoint will be available, and the recipes are on it, and also the substitutions equivalency. So that'll give you some of that. So yes, you will be able to get that. I had one question. This goes to, before we go further, Joan, either Joan, Barbara, or Todd can answer it. Cellulose powder. Would you consider cellulose powder to be an ingredient that might have gluten, depending on the manufacturer?
Yes, I would, absolutely. I would always verify the supply chain on that because you unfortunately, you just don't know.
Okay, thank you. Todd.
Okay, so
gluten-free cooking. Tell us a little bit about the gluten-free cooking technique and process.
Well, so you don't have to be the sharpest tool in the shed to figure out, listen, if it's something that's going to get somebody sick, what do you need? You need to sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. Barbara, I think it was Barbara or Joan touched on this earlier. And you know what? We have a great patient satisfaction coordinator here, Amir. He has a plan, and we have a plan together where we're going to he's buying some purple totes and purple equipment so that we know that we have stuff segregated. So I tell everybody, once you sanitize your stuff, sanitize where you're working. If you have any type of kitchen utensils, put them in separate bins. And the international color is purple for allergenic stuff. So Amir has a plan for that. But even at home, if you're the only one that's celiac and gluten-free in your house, you could get a small tote and put, a 8-inch or 10-inch frying pan away in it, along with tongs and spoons and whips, and put them in a tote and put them away in a closet on a high shelf, so that there's no cross-contamination. So the most simplest technique is the most elementary. You know what I mean? And especially people that have family that have other allergen problems too. If it's not wheat, maybe it's nuts and other things. You don't want to cross-contaminate, any of the food in the kitchen. So that's one of the biggest techniques: sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. And then we talked about, I think Barbara and I talked the other day about things like, when you're doing recipes, read them thoroughly, because when you're doing baking, sometimes you might have to add, gluten is a lifter, and gluten is stability and creates a foundation in pastry. Sometimes you might have to add something like an xanthan or something to suspend that base so that it becomes light, or that it becomes crusty. It holds everything together. So read your recipes thoroughly. And then there's also, you can Google online equations of the density of stuff. So if I'm using, if a recipe calls for regular flour, and say hypothetically it's 1 cup of liquid, well, all these other flours like chickpea and rice flour all have a different density impact. So you really need to look on pretty much the package would tell you, and they usually have recipes on the back, but they might require different amounts of liquid in the product you're baking. So the next slide, we have all the stuff we do. We try to infuse things like sun-dried tomatoes. We try to use rice and beans. We try to use natural sun-dried cranberries and cherries to infuse a sweetness and a flavor to our gluten-free stuff. Also, if you're looking at the slide on the left, these are all products. Nowadays, they have this gluten-free breadcrumbs. We actually create our own gluten-free breadcrumb, a proprietary item also. We took cornmeal, white and yellow. We brown it off in the oven with some Asiago cheese along with some fresh herbs, and we dredge all our flour, dredge our chicken in that. We put it in cornstarch first and then in the breadcrumbs, and we have our own breadcrumb, which is flourless breadcrumb. Another, also looking at the slide, you see the Bob's Red Mill. They have a lot of choices, especially if you're cooking at home. Not so much institutional, but if you're out there cooking on a smaller scale, Bob's has a great line of stuff. And once again, seek out, go to naturally gluten-free places. And there's really a lot of them now. There sure is. I'll tell you what, years ago, you couldn't find anything out there gluten-free. Now, even main stores like ShopRite, supermarkets, usually have aisles that have gluten-free.
So a question to you, is mix versus better than scratch, using a mix or making things from scratch? Is it an option, or is it better, or it's equivalent? What would you say from a chef's point of view? Joan and Barbara, please feel free to chime in on that question.
So from a chef's point of view, I always feel scratch is from best because I know what's going in it, right? So Barbara touched on earlier knowing your sauce, right? So maybe there's products out there, they might say gluten-free, but then you see in a disclaimer made in a factory that contains wheat, right? So you don't know. But if you make it fresh from start and you're the one producing it, then you know what's going in it. You know it's safe. Okay, so that's coming from an industry. Oh, I'm sorry, Barbara. So that's coming from me as a chef.
Right. And that's a great point, Todd. And the other thing is, as we know, that when you have mixes or you have prepared foods, you have a lot of fat and sodium in there, because when they take gluten out, they're going to put something back in. So a lot of times what they put in there is fat and salt. And that's definitely not good. And when you're making it yourself, you're always better off when you're doing scratch cooking.
So when I look at, thank you. So when I look at this and I look at the variety that you make everything, Todd, so within your facility you're giving options, but perhaps people don't have the labor or the men have the expertise. Would you recommend outsourcing some of the products, whether it's, Barbara's bakery goods that are gluten-free or your chicken and franchise gluten-free? Because I know you both have businesses that offer this to food service venues. Would you recommend one versus the other, or can it supplement what they're doing? Because labor being the way it is, between labor and staffing and training, not always is it easy to do, especially if you don't need it for the full house. So you're first, Todd, and then Barbara.
Okay. So honestly, I said earlier, my feeling is if you make it fresh, you know what's in it. I know in our kitchens, when we say we're doing a certain item gluten-free, whatever that is, it's gluten-free. It's been sanitized. We're not using any flour. So I feel comfortable with that. I think the bottom line is in gluten-free, and this is for anybody out there, if somebody calls down, whether it's a patient or a customer, comes into a restaurant or what have you, and they say, is it gluten-free? And you're taking something out of a case and you don't know where it's been prepared, you don't know what's in it, you can't safely tell that person that it's gluten-free. And if they eat something and it's not, you just lost not only a customer, but you lost the trust of a fellow person that'll never come back to you. So my feeling is there's that balance, but if you don't have the time and you want to buy it from an approved source, make sure it's a source that you know where it's coming from and you know that they strictly abide by the gluten-free production or gluten-free techniques. And I think it's okay, and there's that balance. And I'll tell you, one thing is a lot of it has to do with a lot of our clients. A quick story. I have a good friend, corporate executive chef of a giant food service company here in the Northeast. His son has really bad allergies, gluten-free. The reason I got started in this, the restaurant he likes to go to, they were so afraid of him coming in and saying to him, well, we prepared a gluten-free dish for your son, but we can't guarantee it. We started making the stuff for this restaurant and cryovacuuming it because we have a secure kitchen. We don't even bring any flour in the kitchen. So we got involved because this buddy of mine that's a corporate executive chef for a giant food service company here in the Northeast, we supply to the restaurants that he likes to go to. And he actually goes to them restaurants because of that. Now, he could bring in a party of 10, and he knows his son's safe by eating the meals. And they come cryovac, they put them either in a microwave or steamer, and the wait staff has scissors that comes to the table, they cut the bag and they slide it out, and his son has a allergenic-free dinner right there, and he can eat it right on that plate. Don't have to worry about cross-contamination or anything. So if you know the place, I think it's a great balance. You could do both.
Okay, Barbara?
Yeah, sure, absolutely, Marcia. Yep, Todd is 100% correct, and you have to have a trusted source. And one of the things that's going on with products that you're buying now, a lot of these smaller gluten-free companies have been purchased by larger manufacturers, and where they used to test every product, now they're testing huge batches. So that's really detrimental, because you can have and I know of an incident where someone was having soup, and it was canned soup, and it was supposed to be gluten-free, and they actually got I don't know whether it's the bottom or the top, but they actually got more than 20 parts per million in their can of soup, and it was the organization, it was the president of the organization that was actually certifying the product to be gluten-free. And so that's so important to understand, that you need to, when you're buying something, it has to be from a trusted source. You have to understand the labeling rules, and you have to make sure that the people are doing it properly. Because it's one thing to eat it if it's not as a medical necessity, and you eat it and okay, so I ate gluten. But a person like myself with celiac disease, if you're going to eat that, you're going to be sick, and you're going to be sick for months. And you're going to end up with an incidence of cancer, and you're going to be back to square one, and that's not a great feeling, especially in the healthcare industry. You want to make sure that your job is to make people well and not to make them sick.
Okay, so I've got a couple questions, but I wanted to say one of the things you mentioned is about keeping things separate, and one of the things that I mentions what you see on the screen now is an area, maybe a kiosk in a cafeteria, if you have students, or in a retail environment. You have a kiosk in the front that actually is purple and denotes allergen safe free, and any, like Todd had said, any products you're using, pans, are kept in this area and are not cross-contaminated. So think about those kind of options. Also, if you do something in the back, like a pod or a meal assembly, have an allergen-free pod that is allergen-free for everything, so that people who use whatever utensils is clean for that area. One thing that was asked is a question, and any one of the speakers can take it. If a colander is cleaned and sanitized, is that acceptable as gluten-free? That was the question. If a colander is cleaned and sanitized, is that acceptable to be gluten-free?
We would always recommend, particularly with a colander, because of pasta and how it sticks and with the holes in it, it's really not, it's difficult to clean. But something like a colander, we would recommend have a separate one that would be designated for the gluten-free area. And that's why it's so important that wherever you're doing your preparation and cooking and everything, that you do have a designated area that is, in our training program, we call it the gluten-free zone or the allergen-free zone, and there's labeling there, there's signage there, so everyone knows. But with a colander, definitely we would say get one specifically just for your allergen or gluten-free area.
So, and I would say what I've seen out there is also, if you do any kind of kiosk in the front, I've always seen a separate toaster, both front and back, for the same reasoning. Okay. Right. Should wooden spoons be also separated? That was a question. Wooden spoons, stainless steel spoons.
I honestly, I'm not so sure I would cook with wooden spoons, because I'll tell you what, they become non-porous after a while, and the flour could absorb into the wood. The traces of it. I mean, the flour can't absorb into the wood, but the traces of it and the remnants of it. So even if you sanitize it, I'm not so sure that wood would be, wooden spoons would be that great to use. Especially, even if you're sanitizing it, I probably wouldn't use that. But once again, whatever you use, you should keep it separate. You know what I mean? It should be in a separate tote. So if it's a colander, buy a colander just for, for gluten-free cooking. Or if you're, using spoons and knives and stuff, just buy it and
How
keep
about
it separate, because safety, listen, safety is the key issue for
how
all
about
of
pot
us, right?
holders? Pot holders, someone asked, is pot holders. And someone
That
said
would
pot holders, what would you recommend for pot holders?
I would
Once
do. I
again,
would keep everything separate, absolutely,
yeah,
because you don't know. Because if somebody has flour on their hands and they use the pot holder, and then they then they forget to wash their hands and they pick something else up, and it's just such a huge liability. And I would just, again, and Todd, I'm sure you agree, everything should just be separate and different color, and just keep it separate, and use it as needed for gluten-free, allergen-free, as well as people who are not gluten-free and don't have food allergies.
right. You know
So
what? And I agree 1,000%. The one thing I want to touch on is any of us in this industry, in food service or any food service, whether it's institutional or retail or what have you, or restaurants, you know what? In the very end, it's our reputation on the line. And I don't want to be a chef out there to tell somebody that it's gluten-free and then have them get sick. I don't want that, you know, and it's our
so
reputations.
so let me just, I have one additional question, and then any other questions I will try to answer, and then I want you to each to leave everyone with two top points. One question was, they were asking about aprons, which again is employee aprons, which I would think if someone is working with allergen-free, the same principle as the pot holders, I would agree. But oven and turbo microwaves, do we need to have separate for cooking? Ovens and turbo chef microwaves, do we need to have separate for gluten-free items?
Well, traditionally, if you're going to use a microwave, if you're doing something in there, you should cover it anyways, right? Because most people should cover it because of splatter and stuff. So I think if it's covered, you know, with say saran wrap or something over the top, it might be okay. But convection oven, once again, if I had, you know, banana bread in there blowing around, it's going to get that, the remnants of it is going to get all over the place. So, you know, you might want to convection, you might want to have a separate convection oven.
Okay. So going back and looking at Joan and Barbara, you've given us a lot of information which will be available in this PowerPoint. But going back, and if you had to say to somebody, you know, I know this is another obstacle, something else you have to deal with. You have all these challenges, whether you're a consumer, whether you're a food service or grocery store. What kind of strategy, top two things each of you can give that you would say, don't forget, as you walk away today, don't forget this. So let's start with Joan, top two things.
Okay, thanks, Marcia. I would say that the education and training are key to whatever clientele you're servicing. Education of the staff, starting with the clinical aspects. And we have worked with a restaurant. One of our clients was a restaurant, and we worked with the front and the back of the house. And my background as a nurse, I went into the clinical aspects of celiac disease, so they have an understanding of what really somebody who gets contaminated by gluten, what would happen to them. And I think that's so important that whatever institution you're in, whatever your business is education, 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 and then the training. How do you serve this customer? How do you bring out their food so that it doesn't have there's no cross contact with it. So those are the two utmost, I think, of importance, because until you have an understanding of the clients or the patients or the that you're dealing with, you won't necessarily know the best way to work with them, and that will ultimately be the best for the for your customer. So those are the two most important things, I think.
Thank you, Joan.
To start with.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to pause for a minute because we have less than a minute. And so I'm going to go from Barbara to Todd. I meant Joan to Todd, and if we have some time after that. Todd?
Yes, well, so bottom line is,
less than a minute. Less than a minute before it.
Safety, 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 and communications with your staff. Communicate, communicate, communicate. You could, you know, always hit the nail on the head and tell staff, communicate to them the severity of the gluten-free in the patients, and if they get sick, how severe it is. So safety and communication is a key.
Okay. And Barbara, because of time, I'm going to have to, at this point, I'm going to cut it down. But thank you, everybody, for coming on. I appreciate it. We'll have follow-up, any other questions. But thank you, and I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Marcia.
Marcia. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia.